Hi everyone, it's so nice to be in this space with you all. My name is Maria Contreras, she, her pronouns. I'm the Community Policy Associate for the Collaborative Responses to Commercial Sexual Exploitation Initiative at the National Center for Youth Law. Um, Thank you for the rep team for having us. I have the pleasure of introducing three amazing board members today. Alia, Angelica, and Chelsea are members of the CSEC Action Team Advisory Board. And then in a little bit, they will tell you a little more about themselves and all the incredible things that they do. Just for a little bit of background information, the advisory board is a body of 10 lived experience experts that consult on everything and anything having to do with CSEC and how to best support and serve youth and families who are impacted by commercial sexual exploitation in California and beyond. So if you would like to know more specifically about the advisory board, please feel free to reach out to me and I could put my email in the chat if that's easiest. And so why are we here? So we are here to discuss the intersection of reproductive health equity and the experiences of young people who are experiencing commercial sexual exploitation, and how to best support those young people through their reproductive experiences. So that means anything having to do with contraception, to medical care, with their reproductive organs, with pregnancy, with parenting, all of that good stuff. And this is one of those intersections that seems obvious, but there is such a lack of open discussion about how that intersection manifests in the ways we care for the youth who are seeking reproductive care with these specific experiences. And so today we hope we can provide a clearer sense of what this means and some practical strategies to serve young people in a way that moves forward the goals of making reproductive equity and justice a reality for all young people. We are going to hold questions for the end if we have time. If you have a question and you are not sure if you're asking it in a trauma-informed way, that is totally okay. But I ask you that you private message me directly, just so that I can see the question. And this is not to discourage anyone from asking questions, but rather to make sure people, especially our board members and anyone in the audience, feel comfortable in the space. And so now I have the pleasure of turning it over to my colleagues who are going to introduce themselves. Alia, would you like to go first? I think you're muted.
There we go. And I apologize, I'm not in the best lighting, but my name is Alia. I'm a member of the California CSEC Action Team. I'm also Director of Aftercare for Safe House Project. And I'm just really honored to be here today.
Thank you, Alia. Angelica?
Hello, everybody. My name is Angelica Zuniga. I'm also a member of the CSEC Action Team. I am the CEO of Redeemed Home, which is a local safe haven here in Kern County, where we house survivors over the age of 18 that came out of the commercial sex industry. And I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Chelsea?
Hello, everybody. My name is Chelsea Holzer. I'm also a member of the CSEC Action Team Advisory Board, and I work for an agency called Project 180 as a case manager in a rapid diversion program, helping people seek treatment instead of incarceration. And I'm also very excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. And so now, we may have some folks who are very well versed in what CSEC means, and we may have some folks who are just starting to learn, and that's totally fine. And so that's why we want to start with Chelsea. Can you give us a definition of what CSEC is?
Yeah, so the legal definition, and I wanted to just be really simple, is anyone under the age of 18 who trades something of value for sexual acts. I also want to just clarify that we know that just because someone turns 18, or I want to, make that a point that just because someone turns 18 does not automatically mean that they are not experiencing exploitation. I think there's this, belief that once someone is 18, they're an adult, and it's a different situation when oftentimes it's not.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And just to add to that, when we say, young people trading something of value, we mean food, shelter, money, and it also means that for some young people, they might recognize their experience as survival sex. That's still trafficking because somebody has authority and power over that young person. And sometimes there's a third party exploiter or trafficker, as we would call them, involved in facilitating trafficking of that young person. Thank you, Chelsea, for providing that. And so now I'm going to go ahead and ask you, Alia, first. Can you describe the intersection of reproductive health and commercial sexual exploitation? What does that look like?
Well, I think it's important to note that healthcare in general has one of the highest intersection points with survivors. It's something like over 80% of survivors or people who've experienced exploitation will intersect with a healthcare professional at some point, and many of those will be reproductive health care. So whether that would be in an effort to get birth control, in an effort to get STD testing or treatment, in an effort to terminate a pregnancy or to maintain a pregnancy or in birth, or just to maintain reproductive health in any other way, the intersection points there are very, very high. And so that can look a lot of different ways. I mean, it can look like sane nurses with sexual assault treatment in a hospital, and a lot of other intersection points as well. And so I think it's really important for one to be having these types of conversations, but also be training the people who are in those positions in those reproductive health partnerships and organizations, because without training, one, those experiences are often very traumatic, and that's something that I think most of us have experienced and most of us have seen in the clients that we've served, that when we don't look at the likelihood that 80% of survivors have intersected with a healthcare professional, the majority of those have likely had a traumatic experience with a healthcare professional as well, especially in reproductive health. So one, that they have the ability to be trauma informed, and two, that they have the ability to identify someone, because oftentimes people with lived experience don't have the words or understanding to identify their own circumstances. And so it's really an opportunity for identification and service provision as well.
Thank you so much, Alia. Chelsea, Angelica, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so I just wanted to note here too that this could look different too for some kids that may have never had access to any type of healthcare before, and then you're coming across someone who you're trying to link, right, to try to make that linkage, and just understanding that not everybody has had access to that or was denied those types of medical care, or may have never been seen by a doctor for many, many years. And that could definitely look like resistance. It could look like someone doesn't want to, when there's a whole lot more behind that needs to be kind of looked at in terms of getting someone to access this type of care.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Chelsea, I'm going to turn it back to you again. Why is it important to specifically talk about supporting youth who have or are experiencing exploitation?
I think it's really important because a lot of times, there's a lot of kids that go unseen or may have been out of contact, with their family or other support systems. I think that it's definitely a very complicated thing for some people to understand, specifically when someone's been exploited. I think sometimes, we run into people's own personal opinions or their biases about, why someone may have been involved in that type of life. So I think, this population specifically, we need to be a little bit more educated in what they're facing or what has happened in their life prior to the treatment they may be seeking now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Angelica, Alia, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can add on that. And I think Chelsea touched on it, but a lot of those things that maybe a healthcare professional might chalk up to like risky behavior, or there's even another word that I've heard used, like unhealthy behavior, or irresponsible reproductive health practices, I guess, is what I have heard. I'm not saying that they are, I'm saying that that is a term that I have heard used to describe youth and things that have happened to them when they've answered certain questions that are asked in reproductive health places, like such as, you know, have you ever had an STD? How many pregnancies have you had? How many abortions have you had? How many sexual partners have you had? That those kinds of things, if we are not changing the way that we're looking at those, we're missing signs and ability to connect someone with services and potentially exit them from their situation if that's what they're looking for, or if they would take that opportunity. Also, it's so important because the damage that healthcare professionals can cause is equal to the impact that they can create. In the same way that if, and this is what we hope to have happen, if somebody hears some of these answers to those questions and thinks this could be a trafficking situation, they have the ability to impact that person's life, their children's life, their grandchildren's life, like in an extreme way, by connecting them with services and recognizing those signs. In the same way, they have the ability to create that same impact in the negative by even just their words. We have a friend who was, who experienced exploitation, who it was no longer able to have children because of her exploitation, and the way that news was described, given to her by the doctor, caused such deep trauma that it's something that 30 years later she still feels a lot of emotion about. And so the impact of our words in these situations are just as important as the impact of our actions when we do recognize something. So being trauma informed, being compassionate, looking deeper than just an answer to a question, just really, really has the ability to create impact on either side.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that you added that, because one of the things that, come to mind that I've heard from my experience serving young people is like, yes, the impact of words, and then the action that creates for the young person. So for example, if a youth comes in and they're young and they're pregnant, then the response of the provider, the advocate, the direct service provider, even outside of medical care, should never be to shame or to be like, oh my God, what are you doing? But rather like, I'm so glad you're here. Let's figure out what you need and what we can do, because the likelihood of a young person returning to a provider that made them feel safe and not shamed is that much greater than if you shame them and then basically are telling them that like you don't want to care for them, that it doesn't matter. So I really, really love that you shared that, Alia. And then give me 1 second. Like, I think one of the things that we often have talked about are just like what the importance of even beginning to understand this intersection, because it has impacts intergenerationally. And what does that look like? Can one of you speak to the impacts that commercial sexual exploitation have on, families?
I know for myself, I was a second generation victim in the industry, and so it was like, my trafficker ended up was a family member of mine, was my mother, and so it was like the influence, right, of just our normal, or my reality of watching her as a young girl, in the life, heavily active in the life. And then that became my normal, that became my reality. Like, I had bare minimum school. We were traveling up and down the Central Valley where I was trafficked, and running from CPS and just never seen a doctor. And I started having my children at a very young age. I had my first child at 15, and so never getting any kind of healthcare for myself, and never really being like any red flags popping up when I would go to to give birth, and it just being like the normal for our life. And so For many years, I didn't even understand that I was being trafficked. And so going into, the hospitals, I was like, I didn't have words for my situation. I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me. So that was just something I really wanted to touch on.
Thanks, Angelica. Alia, I saw you muted. Chelsea, do
Nope.
you have to add?
You call on me, Maria?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was just asking.
Okay, yeah, I didn't make sure, Alia didn't want to go. I know for me, I was that kid that didn't, get any type of medical care throughout my whole life. I was raised by, a parent who was addicted and had a lot of her own issues. And, it's interesting. I think a lot of people think, like once someone is able to get out of life, that this like kind of all goes away. And it's like the furthest thing from the truth, I have been, in abusive situations all my life. And so the way it continued to show up for me after getting out of life is that I continue to cycle through domestic violence relationships. I had my first child, which did help me get out of the life. And then I didn't really experience the consequences, of what I was living through until I had kids. One of my partners did something really horrific in our life in 2018, and it brought DCFS in my life. And I remember them looking at me and just going like, "What happened to you?" Right? What happened? And it was just such a vulnerable moment for me for someone to see that, I wasn't choosing to continue this life. It was literally the only thing that I knew how to do. And I was just someone that just didn't get the help in time. I had experience when I did get to a doctor. I had such a horrific thing said to me by this male professional that I literally avoided healthcare for the next 15 years of my life. I think oftentimes when we go to seek medical care, it's like the agenda of the professional, right? Like they're looking at what they see wrong about you. And I think that that's just how it continued to show up for me, through cycles of violence that maybe looked different. They weren't me being trafficked, but definitely still abuse.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. And I think like a lot of the time, like that connection with like how it impacts like our children and the children around us is really important too. And I should have shared this in my introduction, but I'm also a survivor. I'm not a board member, but I help support the board. And so I think one of the things that really always resonates with me and one of my passions, it's like what impact do providers have on making sure that they provide the best care, the best trauma-informed care to young people that they're suspecting have this experience? I mean, honestly, it feels like they should be providing trauma-informed care regardless, but especially if they're suspecting there's something going on, because that has impacts for future generations. Like, for example, if you're caring for a young parent who, is like, that she's like smoking or doing substances, instead of trying to force and repeating trying to force her to quit, like trying to figure out what's going on. I'm trying to actually, talk with her about what are some of the things that may be going on in this young person's life, and not immediately necessarily jumping to the conclusion that this person is going to be or is a bad parent, because then that has repercussions for future, potential child welfare involvement. And for those of you who don't know, there are so many of our young people who are experiencing exploitation who are also system involved, and that's definitely not a coincidence. And so I urge you to, become more educated on those intersections. But also, I know we're talking a lot about, a lot of dismal things, but there are things that folks can do. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. So now that you're, Chelsea, you brought up, talking about specifically medical providers. So what are things that medical providers should know when caring for a youth they may or may not know is experiencing commercial sexual exploitation?
I think the biggest thing that, you know, I'd want them to know is like life, like I mean, I already knew what was wrong, right? Like I already knew that my life was in a really bad place. I already knew that the things that I was doing were self-destructive, right? So I knew that, right? And I think that what I would have liked to see them do different is maybe focus more on the areas that I was coming to them for, other than the things that they were spotting out themselves. I think it's also really important to recognize that, you know, people experiencing this type of exploitation are almost always in some type of dangerous situation, especially if they're still in the life actively. I mean, traffickers monitor their victims very well. And so like people aren't always in a position to maybe be able to tell you what's going on. So I think it's important to like read the room, like who is this person coming with? Like, are they coming with somebody? You know, are they nervous? You know, like things like that I think are really important.
Thanks, Chelsea. Angelica, Ollie, anything you'd like to add? Okay. Thanks.
I'm
Chelsea.
sorry, I'm having trouble with my Wi-Fi. It keeps on saying bad connection, so I'm not trying to drop the call right now.
Oh, no worries. Thanks for letting us know. And are you able to hear us fine?
Yes,
Okay, great.
I'm gonna move to a different location. I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. Do what you need to do. And so, you know, you talked about medical providers. I don't know if we have any medical providers here, but you know, you also talked a lot about how hard it is for young people with this experience to even want to or have access to medical providers. So like what can advocates or service providers not in the medical field do to like be able to facilitate and advocate on behalf of young people when they do want to or are seeking medical care?
Can I jump in on this one? Choice, consent. Like the ability to say no to an exam, the ability to say yes to an exam. Again, kind of what Chelsea was just saying, in that like being treated for the thing that you asked for treatment for is validating. Like it's so validating to like know, like this is not a reproductive health example, but like just an example, like I've worked with youth that have had a lot of damage done to their teeth and their mouth, and they've gone to the doctor for a completely different like situation, and their like oral health is like a source of shame for them, and like they know going in there that is going to be something that the doctor points out, and so it avoids them, but they avoid getting help for other areas of their body because they're concerned about this area that they're not asking for help for in this environment at this point. And so like being able to know what's expected, like having talk throughs through this is what you're going to expect, having a medical professional who is on the other side of those talk throughs that the advocate can depend on to know they will do what the advocate just laid out as what will happen is so great. I've had to take youth to SANE exams for sexual assault exams because the youth agreed to that and requested that. And the way that they walk through nowadays, not how it was 20 years ago, but nowadays, how they walk through those exams with like every single touch, there is an ask, like, are you ready to continue? Are you okay with me continuing? I'm like, there's a talk through of what's going to happen. And then like every single little thing in that exam, there's a talk through of what's going to happen, and there's consent asked for, and the youth can stop at any time. And they can stop or they can pause or however that is. And so like, that's one way in that this practice is already being utilized, but I think that we can expand on that, and we can advocate for our youth by talking to the medical professionals that we know our youth are seeing, to ensure that they're on the same page. And if they're not, we can go seek a different medical professional. Like we don't have to like be fighting huge uphill battles to do this. Like we can be working with like-minded people that want to put our youth first, because the last thing we want is to compound the trauma of the youth that we're serving, so that a medical issue becomes greater. A pregnancy that the youth wants is no longer viable because of something that they didn't receive medical care, and all of these things that can create even more compound trauma in a youth that's already experienced that. The other piece in that is like, so much of it is teaching the youth to use their voice in those situations as well, and remembering that like we as advocates are only going to be with them for a short period of their life. Like when they're 35, the hope is they don't still have an advocate going with them. They may not have access to one, even if they need one. And so our job is also not only to be advocating for them, but to be teaching them to advocate for themselves, to know that they can have this and they can have those things respected, or they can turn around and they can walk out and make a different doctor's appointment. But the more we can introduce them with medical professionals that care and medical professionals that are on the same page, the greater likelihood we have that they're going to get that message reinforced that advocating for themselves is safe. So that they can do it in harder situations as they get older.
Yes, all of that. Thank
Can
you
I
so
add
much.
to that?
Of course, go for it.
I wanted to just say, I thought what you just sparked what I said. Also like choice in who you see, right? Like having lots of different options, like, well, maybe I didn't like that person that much, and like not drilling that too much. Like if I just didn't feel good with you, like I didn't feel good with you, and I don't, I have a doctor now who I finally started to see, and my primary care doctor, I would say, well, I really don't like him, so I'm not going to go. And she was like, well, let's pick a new one, right? Like, let's pick a new one. Let's try somebody else out. I think giving youth like a lot of different choices is really, really important. And then also like asking them about their experience afterwards. Like, how did that go? Or like, is there something you would want to do different next time? Or were they nice to you? Like, because I remember my interaction with that doctor. I was brought to that doctor by a placement, and I don't remember anybody ever asking me like, hey, was that an okay appointment for you? And like, I had been so abused at that point that I was used to it. I don't think I wasn't even gonna tell anybody that had happened to me.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Chelsea. That like kind of reminds me, like I avoided going to an OB for so long, and I ended up like having major issues. Like I got diagnosed with cervical cancer when I was 21, so that has like really significant impacts on a young person's health. So making sure that people feel comfortable is so important. And I also like part of why I avoided for so long was because the last time I had gone to an OB, like the doctor kicked me out because I was being quote unquote difficult because I wasn't feeling comfortable getting a pelvic exam. And so like also making sure that people like medical providers and the advocates in the room and the nurses who are there, like, no, if a young person says no, then the response is like, okay, that's fine. You want to take a break and try again, or let's schedule you for a different appointment. And so let's get into that a little bit, because we're talking about all of the different things that people can do and the importance of that. Can we talk a little bit about how does that trauma like what might people see in a young person that might get relabeled as being difficult, as being in denial, as being not cooperative, all of these things that we hear about young people that are usually, in my mind, expressing a need or a manifestation of complex trauma. Let's unpack that a bit. And anyone feel free to jump in.
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is like, I was always the person like didn't want to go and didn't really have a reason for you of why I didn't want to go. And I was just kind of met with this response of like, well, you need to go, or you have to go, or this is what, you're supposed to do, right? I think I was definitely labeled resistant for that, but there was no conversation around like what's going on around this, right? That is the reason why you don't want to go.
Yeah, for sure. Angelica, I think I saw you.
Yeah, I know one of the roles that I have here in Kern County is I'm contracted with the Department of Human Services with the CSEC unit, and I'm able to work with the youth that are in juvenile hall. And so in that, able to go with them to doctor's appointments. And I've had this one youth that I'm thinking of that was, always what they want to call like problem, she would give problems when she would go to her visits, and just her emotions, she would just be highly uncooperative. And so finally being able to go with her and unpack like what was happening with her was that she was trafficked by a doctor. And so going to a doctor's appointment just made all the emotions just arise, and she didn't know how to respond. She didn't know how to fill out the paperwork. She didn't understand why now she was being triggered, and just being able to identify that, with the youth, that it was very important, and just in her healing journey, to be able to first identify that and then be able to relate as her advocate, to other service providers, that maybe we switched to a female, and then just being able to, because of her lack of education as well, like me being able to read off the questions, that way she was able to answer correctly or explain what the question was really asking.
The other thing I've experienced with youth is I've had a couple that their trauma response has come out in like almost like an over sexualized like tone in these kinds of situations, where like just saying things that might not be deemed like appropriate for the situation, about like pelvic exams and about their I of course know their history, but like when they've discussed, like when they've answered those kind of demographic questions about what their sexual history is, and just thinking like they would probably be answering this whether I was here or not like this, and how that doctor like they would likely hear this as like, this child is out of control, instead of hearing it as like, this is this child making sense of these terrible things that have happened to them, because this is a lot easier to say and make a joke and like use this graphic description than it is to be like, this is what has actually happened to me. And so that's one thing I've seen as well. And then on the flip side of that, like complete dissociation, which is tends to be like my area of expertise. Like that, just the total disassociation, where like you can tell that this person does not want to talk, does not want to be there, and like is completely zoned out during any sort of exam or conversation around like body parts or things like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Alia. Thanks so much for adding that. I think I want to touch a little bit about, how it might manifest either in pregnancy, because I remember like I have 2 children, and my first child was rough because I was being exploited while I was pregnant with my son. And part of it was me being in denial. Like I literally, up to the point where I had contractions, I was just in denial that I was even pregnant. And people would tell me that I was about to have a baby, and I would still say that I wasn't gonna have a baby. And when like, I was like literally pushing this human out. And so providers may see that as like, this person doesn't want to be a parent, which in some ways it could be true, because this person may not have been able to choose that they were going to be parents. But it could also be that the young person just doesn't have the mind. Like if they go into the space where they're accepting that they're going to be parents, that could be destructive for them. I remember like, and this is going to be potentially triggering for some of you in the room, so I apologize, feel free to step away, but like my acceptance of being a parent when I didn't choose that was a trigger for suicidal ideation, because I just could not handle it at the time, especially given that I was still being trafficked. And so the other thing that could happen too, and like the birth of my son and my daughter are completely different, because my daughter is 13 years apart from my son, and I'm no longer experiencing exploitation, and yet some of those same triggers remain. So like I forced myself to breastfeed because that's what I felt was the best thing for my daughter, and that's what people tell you is the best thing for your daughter. But every experience was triggering, to be honest. And as soon as my daughter turned 1, I stopped, even though people around me were like, oh, you should do it for longer. And it's like, no, actually, I can't do this anymore. Like it's bad for my emotional health to have someone attached to me in such an intimate way. And so being mindful of like what you're presenting to a young person as like the healthier option or like the best option, because that might not be the best option for them. Same thing with like when people talk about like you know, choice. We're lucky that we live in California, even though we know there's some issues with like choice even here, depending on access and all of that. But like, does the young person actually want to have this pregnancy? Or like choosing where to give birth? Like, does this young person want to have like a birth worker and at home birth? Or do they want to have an epidural right when they get to the hospital? Like, all of those things need to be communicated in a way that's, going back to Alia's very important point, like choice, like giving the young person as much information as they need to make an informed choice at every single step of the way. Just wanted to add that for a minute. And Alia, I think you were about to speak when I cut you off. So if anyone wants to add anything,
I just affirm all of that. Like, I know for myself, breastfeeding and birth and pregnancy were very, very triggering experiences. The feeling of like being out of control of your body that happens in pregnancy was extremely triggering. The experience of having a lot of people in your personal space with very little choice during hospital birth is very triggering. Having somebody, like you said, attached to you in such an intimate way for so long, very, very triggering. Especially as a young person wanting to do the right thing, but not having the language to say it as eloquently as you did at this point in time back then. However, like on the flip side of that, like I had an experience with my first child when I was very young, where I technically didn't have choice because I just had a home birth because that's what everyone else in the area that I was living did. But like that experience of having my first child was a much less triggering experience than having my subsequent children, which I had in hospitals because of the like choice that I had in that, and because of the like familiarity with the people that were going to be there, the familiarity even with my exploiter in the room. Like, it was still like such a less triggering experience because of the familiarity, because of the lack of invasiveness, because of the like I got to choose positions, got to choose water, got to choose the food that I ate, got to choose like whether I walked around, like didn't have to have an IV, like all of these things that I like got to have because of that. And then in that also, like I personally had a midwife during the time that I had my first child, and like I don't bless her heart for saying this, but like it was not probably what most people were thinking, but she affirmed me over and over again that she knew that I was going to be such a good mom, and she believed it so deeply that I believed it. And like looking back over the situation, like there was nothing that was going on openly in my life that would have made like to where she should have said that to me. But her, just the one person saying that, and like every time when she did a checkup, just that she would say that over and over again, and how great I was doing, even though it wasn't true, like made me willing and able to make even some like better choices for myself and my child at that point, and then greater choices in the future that like would not have come if I had just received the prenatal care that I had in the beginning, which was very off-putting.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There's just so much power in what you just shared. Because it just, it just depends on the young person and what their needs. And it's just so important to ask them what they want and empower them. And those reminders of saying like, you are going to be a good parent are just so important. Because sometimes people say like, you become what people tell you you are. And so we want to fill young people up with good things, not break them down further than what's happening.
Can I jump in really fast? I kind of like the just to piggyback on what Alia said, but my situation was totally different. So the first time that I had a child, again, I was 15 years old, and I remember service providers and family members in the room with me, and they were not speaking those things over me. They were like, this is what you wanted. I don't know why you're doing this, like all the things. And then on my second pregnancy, when I'm delivering my child, the doctors and nurses did refuse to give me an epidural because they're like, this is her second pregnancy back to back. And she's only 16 years old. And so I had my second child 16 years old, and excuse me, I'm just like, whoa, 16 years old, natural, childbirth, and everyone just like let her, hearing the banter of the nurses and the doctors, like, well, she's 16, like let her suffer. Like they refused to give me epidural. My pregnancy, it did happen really, I'm sorry, my delivery was really fast, but at the same time, it was like, I didn't have that. And so it is like words of edification, speaking that over somebody, even especially when they're giving birth. Like, I wish somebody would have done that for me. Like man, it just would have been like maybe a life-changing experience, or just for that moment of peace or clarity. Like, you are going to be a good mother, instead of like, let her suffer. And that's literally what happened.
Much for sharing that, Angelica. Sending you virtual hugs because I know you and I love you and I hate to see you in pain, and I also appreciate all the insight that you add. It's funny that you mentioned that because I had a similar experience with my son. It's like the refusal of just any sort of pain relief was rough, and that has its own traumas with it. When you're like screaming that you need something and people actively telling you no, you can't have it, even though you know that everyone else around you has access to that. It's kind of reaffirming that exploitative situation of like, you don't get what you need, you're just here for this purpose. And so now I want to shift gears a little bit, because during our prep conversations there was a lot of discussion around, it in this society, it's still shameful to talk about even sex, not to mention, commercial sexual exploitation. So can you guys talk about a little bit on like what some of those shameful topics may be, and how can advocates and service providers, normalize some of this and avoid shaming a young person because of their experience?
Honestly, some of those shameful things are the very routine questions, specifically around reproductive health care. Like I even now I've experienced the same thing that you were talking about, Maria, with cervical cancer, and when going through all of those like testing and things, like at the first, like had to break down and disclose like my survivor status at the first one, and just was sobbing the first time I went in to get an OB appointment in many, many years, because of that was going on, and because I felt like I didn't want to answer certain questions without that disclosure being there, but didn't know how to like explain that. So it's something that carries shame, like not just during exploitation, but many, many years after. And like those questions that reproductive health care workers do have to like gather in order to make the best treatment can be triggering. When people ask about prior history of STDs, when people ask about prior pregnancies, living births, abortions, when they ask about number of sexual partners, especially for somebody who's currently experiencing exploitation, like those can be traumatic and triggering things to answer. And that's, I think, where the importance of an advocate comes in, who can prep someone who maybe hasn't had that kind of experience before going to these, or can, if the person wants to have a support person with them in there, that they can have those. A lot of those like treatments are very triggering, especially when it, like in my experience with the process of diagnosing cervical cancer, with the like biopsy stuff that they do is very, very triggering. And like, it's difficult now during COVID, especially. Like I personally had to get that done again recently, which was different than what I had to get done many years ago, because many years ago, I was able to have a support person in the room with me, which was a woman who I trusted, whose hand I held, like when I was dealing with this very triggering thing of having someone inside of my body. for an extended period of time in a very vulnerable position. Those positions are not empowering positions to be in. The physical position of your body during many of those exams is a very vulnerable physical position. And so to be there with a stranger is obviously triggering for anyone who've experienced sexual trauma, let alone exploitation. And so the ability to have a support system and support person in the room, if the youth desires, not every youth wants that. For other youth, that can be triggering as well, is something that's really needed. But if we don't recognize that just the way that our healthcare system is built in kind of these like check the box question things instead of like relationship building to answer questions, like we're missing the mark when it comes to re-traumatizing youth.
Chelsea, Angelica, anything you'd like to add?
I wanted to talk a little bit. For me, I know there was a lot of shame or even lack of knowledge around like menstruation, like my menstrual cycle. When I was trafficked, I was often forced to suppress my menstrual cycle, and that was very traumatic. And I don't know if providers realize that some young people go through that. So I experienced like a lot of anxiety around that, never really properly. I just learned to try to shut it off to make these natural processes that my body did go away, which, you know, wasn't possible, but I was under that pressure. So that was a very shameful thing to need to discuss or just learn about sexual health, because the way I learned about it wasn't accurate at all in any way.
Yeah, Chelsea, thank you for sharing that. And I think like, you know, like menstruation is such, it happens to so many of us, and it's not talked about enough. And just like, I think I would add, like, if you know a young person that is pregnant or has questions about pregnancy, like, I think it's okay to like normalize those questions instead of saying like, oh, you're 16, like you should know that. Didn't you go to sex ed? It's like, well, no, they probably didn't. They may not have somebody at home to teach them that. Like, I know that I didn't grow up with women in my family who were open about talking about those things. And so I felt like I had to find a community of people to be able to just call them and be like, hey, like, is this normal? Like, should this be happening to my body? Like, what should I expect? Like, sometimes young people don't have that, and I don't think that's talked about enough either. So I want to pivot again because I know we're 13 minutes away from ending the session. So I'm hoping that you can share, you know, have you had positive experiences navigating your reproductive health care and what that looks like, so that we can leave attendees with some little golden nuggets.
I know for me, like now, when I go to visit a doctor, I tell them straight out, hey, I've had a lot of trauma with doctors in the past. And I remember I did this recently, and I got such a loving response. The doctor said, well, I'm really sorry that you went through that, right? Like just like validation, care, you know, not shaming someone, not judging someone, you know. I think how we show up in our body language, how we show up in our facial expressions, how we show up in a room, can be felt, you know, it can definitely be felt. So some things are not just always outright said, you know. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Angelica, Alia. I mean, I guess the one thing I would add in terms of like positive experiences now that I'm an adult is like when I go in with my 15-year-old son to the doctor, it's like making sure that I'm being an advocate for him, that I'm having open conversations about sex, that I'm, you know, asking him, like, I'm not going to shame you. My priority is your health. Like, you want to go talk to the doctor by yourself, that's totally fine. You want me to take you to, you know, get STI testing, you just have to say that. I'm not going to ask you questions about why or when or who or whatever. Like, that Like it matters to me because I'm his mom, but it matters to me more that he can trust me and talk to me about like what he needs. And then me, like I honestly sometimes feel like I'm better advocate for other people than myself. And so I'm still like working on like making sure that I'm not like I still cancel my appointments like 3 times before I actually build the
Me
courage
too.
to go. And I'm like, God damn, like I have to go do this, but I really don't want to. And especially with like, I don't know if Alia, you have this experience, but because we've had her cervical cancer, like we don't get the luxury of having a pap smear every 3 years. Like I have to go do it every year, which is really annoying. Because we don't get a break. But like when I was pregnant with my daughter, you know how they, well, some of you may not know, but when you're very early pregnant, like they will give you the little ultrasound wand, like internal ultrasound or whatever that goes like in the vagina. And the lady was like, do you want to do it yourself? And I was like, yes. Like that's yes. Like it feels like a weird moment. And she kind of looked at me like, okay, you're very excited about this. But I was like, it feels so much better that I can control what's happening rather than somebody just shoving up something up there, because obviously that has its own triggers. So I guess that's what I like to share.
I've felt a lot of healing through like my daughter's experience with her doctor, like my middle child's experience. And like she's only 7 and yet he gives her so much agency in her doctor's appointments. And especially in like any sort of like checking of her vaginal area, like he always asks her, and if she says no, then like we don't need to do that then. Like then it's not like this is something that I have to check off on my list. It's like, okay, and he does the whole like, it's only, only mom and like me in the room when your mom is here that ever need to like look there. And if you don't want to do that, like that is okay. And then he just asks me like, have you seen anything with her genitals that is concerning? And like that's like the end of it. Like there is no need to like, well, this is part of the test, so this needs to happen to you. Because I remember those things even prior to my exploitation, but after my abuse, like going through puberty and like having like invasive and feeling like I wasn't even in the room other than just being a body, which I'm sure like that message, even though well-meaning and not abusive, contributed to my exploitation in some small way. There were other things that obviously contributed much more, but like those experiences reinforcing that like you are not the person who has say so over your body, like made an impact. And so like to be able to watch my child like not have those experiences and like be able to have agency just as a young child over her own medical like procedures, and to see like doctors that care, even if it's not like my doctor, to know like, okay, there are safe doctors. It's just an effort of finding one. Like that has been a healing experience as well.
I love that. And that is like such, in my mind, great prevention. Is like empowering our children from the moment that they're born. Maybe even before. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm sure there's a way to empower your children even before. Thank you so much for sharing that, Alia. Angelica, Chelsea, anything else that you'd like to add? I want to leave a few minutes just to see if anyone has any questions before we close out. No? Perfect. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. I hope that you learned a ton from this presentation. I feel like, I talk to these 3 members and the other 7 board members all the time, and I always come away thinking like, I just feel so much more educated and informed, like even with being someone with lived experience. And so I hope that you feel that, and that you know just how much privilege there is in being able to be in the safe space hearing about the lived experiences of people who have, had such complex trauma. And again, if you want to learn more about the advisory board, if you want to submit a consultation request, reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat. But right now is the time to ask questions if you have any. No questions?
Maria, there's a few questions in the Q&A section. I'm happy to read them to you if that would be easier.
Oh, for some reason I don't see my Q&A. Yeah, so if you can read them, that was fine. I trust your judgment on whether something is trauma-informed or not.
They aren't necessarily directed specifically at reproductive health care delivery. And May has provided some responses, but one of the questions I've observed, there's an assumption that youth affected by CSEC for the most part need to be placed in facilities before families. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on if that's a fair assumption based on youth needs, or is there a better way to support living in families and communities and getting needs met?
Who would like to tackle that monster of a question?
I'll check it because I work primarily in aftercare. So I work really, really closely with most of those STRTP programs, and this isn't to say that they're never a solution, because part of my job is making sure that they're good solutions. But like, that's a last case resort. Like, that is a resort when like a youth is not like, I almost say like when we know they're not going to live in, like they're not going to survive. If they're in a family. Like, our goal is always to have a youth with family, and the faster that identification can happen, the more likely that that's going to be successful. If we can identify that a youth is being exploited and access them with high quality services while still like coming alongside their family, if their family of origin is safe and not the people trafficking them, and coming alongside that family with services, I mean, that is like, they have a high likelihood of staying with their family if the family knows how to support them and the youth has access to services. There's like different levels of care, and like, even in those those facilities, those programs, I would rather call them a program than a facility. They're labeled short-term residential treatment programs for a reason. Like, the hope is that they're there to receive the if that is the solution that they need, they're there to receive the stabilization that they need so that they can go into a step down as soon as they're ready. So they're there to have regular access to a therapist who is possibly on site, regular access to any kind of groups, and be in community with peers, and like detox from cell phone and social media if that's like what they need to break that trauma bond or whatever. Like, but it's meant to be a short-term solution. Like, one of the best ways to like have a youth who experienced CSEC reintegrate is to reintegrate them. Like, we're not going to see successful reintegration if a teenager doesn't have the opportunity to ever be a teenager, and mistakes come with being a teenager. And it's all about that. Like, how do we continue to learn? How do we continue to give that person room to grow, while allowing them to have a childhood? Like, we don't want to see our youth growing up and in programs and in congregate care. We want to see them growing up as a part of a family and having some semblance of normality to look back on when they're an adult. So it isn't always a necessity, and I would almost argue that it's an unfortunate reality of where we are at, because the system has been so broken in the way that we've supported youth at this time, and that hopefully we will not need the amount that we have now. Right now, they need to be good, and we need to have them because we can't put the cart before the horse in dismantling a system that isn't serving them well. But the hope is that eventually we will have done our work well enough and connected enough services that youth have the opportunity to stay in families that are safe for them, and that the families are equipped to support them.
Can I add to that real quick? Just real quick. And I just want to say that's so important, because a lot of times, I know for me, when I was trafficked, that's exactly what I was seeking, was some type of family or some type of belonging. So I think that it's extremely important that be the priority.
Yeah, thank you both for adding that. And I also just want to highlight, like, so many of the young people who are confirmed to have CSEC experiences have been flagged by CPS so many times before, which means that by the time a young person has that experience, like, the chance to intervene left, which is a problem. like we have to do so much more prevention work. And a lot of the time what I hear too, especially with teens, is like parents wanting, of course parents love their children, like I'm just gonna make that assumption, but it's like them being like, I don't know what to do. There are no resources for me to be able to support my child. And so now the last thing that they're gonna do is like remove them. And so that's a huge problem, because if we were providing, in my mind, the services that families needed to stay together and to even sometimes prevent CSEC from happening, then we wouldn't have a need for short-term, whatever, group homes, etc. And so like just thinking about like how can we also do the work of like resourcing families and like making sure that everyone has what they need within their own community so that removal isn't even an option. I know that we're right on time, so, and if there's any other questions, feel free to email them to me. I added my email, but you know, feel free to reach out anytime.
Yeah, so I'd just like to thank the presenters for taking the time to share their incredible stories. I'm sure all the attendees could say that this was incredibly valuable, and we just want to thank you for your vulnerability and your willingness to share your time and your experiences. We are coming up on time, but there will be a 10-minute break before our final breakout session of the day. So feel free to grab a glass of water or to practice a little bit of self-care before that continues. But again, thank you presenters for sharing, and thank you attendees for being here and listening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.